Hello. In today's session, we are going to talk about the structured query language. So in this lecture, we will be seeing about the basic definition of SQL, why we wanted to use SQL, history of SQL, SQL process, SQL commands, and SQL RDBMS. So what is this SQL? SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and using SQL, we can access and manipulate databases. And SQL is a standard of the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, and it was founded in 1986, and it is of the International Organization for Standardization in 1987. Why do you want to use SQL? SQL actually allows users to access data in relational database management system, and it also allows users to describe the data, to define the data in the database, and also to manipulate the data which is actually present in the database. And you could also embed these other libraries, pre-compilers with other languages using SQL modules. And SQL also allows us to create and drop databases and tables. It is used to create views, stored procedures, functions in a database, and also it is also used to set permissions on tables, procedures, and views. So there are a number of advantages of using SQL. So next we will see about the history of SQL. So in 1970, Dr. E.F. Ted of IBM is known as a father of relational databases. He described a relational model for databases. So that was the starting of how the relational model came into existence. And in 1974, structured query language was actually described, and it appeared. In 1978, IBM worked to develop CORD's ideas and released a product named System R. And in 1986, IBM developed the first prototype of relational database and standardized it by ANSI. The first relational database was released by Relational Software, and it's later becoming Oracle. Next, we'll talk about what is this SQL process. And in the SQL process, we are also going to see about the SQL architecture of how all these SQL queries are actually processed by the query language. So whenever you wanted to execute an SQL command for any of the RDBMS system, the best way to carry out the request is through the SQL commands and how you actually interpret these tasks. So there are various components included in the SQL architecture or in that process. So the main components are, we'll be having a query dispatcher, an optimization engine, classic query language, and SQL query engine. So this query language or the query engine handles all non-SQL queries, but SQL query engine won't handle logical files. So if you have an SQL query which is actually used to execute or interpret a particular task, it is actually fed to the query language processor. So in the query language processor, it is a process parser and the optimizer which processes that, and it is fed to the DBMS engine where you have the file manager and the transaction manager, and then it is actually stored in the physical database. So that's about the SQL process. Next, we'll see about the main SQL commands. So the SQL commands is a standardization which is actually used to interact with the relational databases. Like you can create, select, insert, update, delete, and drop tables. And these commands can be, the SQL commands can be classified into groups based on their nature or based on the task which is actually assigned to handle the databases. The first one is DDL command, which is called as data definition language. And here we have three commands. The first one is create, which is used to create a new table. You can create a view of a table, and you can also create other objects in databases. Next command is alter command. which is used to modify an existing database object. The database object, for an example, can be a table. The next command is drop command. Drop command is used to delete an entire table. You can also delete a view of a table or other objects that has been created in the database. Next one is DML, which is data manipulation language. And using DML, we have three different commands. The first one is insert command, which is used to insert a record in the table. We have the update command, which is used to modify the records. We have the delete command, which is used to delete the records. And the next language is DCL, which is data control language. And in data control language, we have two commands, which is grant and revoke. The grant command gives certain privileges, is used to give certain privileges to the user. We will see some of the examples in the forthcoming lecture series. And the revoke command takes back the privileges granted to the user. It takes back, in fact, it takes back the privileges that has been granted using the grant command. You can revoke all the privileges given to the user using the revoke command. Next is the DQL language, which is data query language. And in data query language, you just have one command, which is a select command. And using the select command, you can retrieve certain records from one or more tables based on some conditions. You can also give some conditions on the select command, which we will be seeing in the forthcoming lectures. Next, we move on to SQL RDBMS concepts. So what is this concept of RDBMS? So RDBMS stands for Relational Database Management System. And RDBMS is the basis for SQL and all modern database systems like MS SQL Server, IBM DB2, Oracle, MySQL, and Microsoft Access. The relational database management system is a database management system that is based on the relational model as introduced by EF Cod. So we will see some of the RDBMS concepts in detail. So first concept which we're going to see is the table concept. So in RDBMS, the database objects are called as tables. And what is this table? A table is actually going to be a collection of related data entries, and it consists of rows and columns. And the table that a user creates is actually the simplest form of data storage in a relational database. So for an example, if in this slide, I have given you a customer's table, and this table is called as a customer table. And here, if you see, we have the rows and columns of that customer table, and all the data entries which you see in this particular customer table are related to each other. So this is an example of a customer table where you have the rows. We have about 7 rows, and we also have columns, about 5 columns we have, which are the first column is ID, second column is name, third column is age, fourth column is address, and the fifth column is a salary. So this is a typical simple table called as a customers table. Next, we move on to the next concept in RDBMS, which is a field. So we've seen what a table is. So this particular table is broken up into smaller entities called fields. The fields in the customer table, which you're actually seeing, consist of ID, name, age, address, and salary. So what is this field? A field is a column in a table that is designed to maintain specific information about every record in the table. So if you see the record, the first record in the table, then we have ID, which is 1. So if you see, the ID is actually related to Ramesh, and age of Ramesh is also given as 32. So if you see, for every row in this particular table, the ID, or the field is a column in a table that is designed to maintain specific information about every column in the table. So that's actually called as a field concept in RDBMS. Next one is record or a row. So this record is also called a row of table in each individual entry that exists in the table. So for example, if you have this in the customers table, if you see there are 7 different rows. So each and every row in this customer table is called, there are, as you have 7 records in the customers table, each and every record is actually called as a row. You can also say that a record is a horizontal entity in a table. So if you see this particular first row, so this is a horizontal entity in a table. Next, we are going to talk about the column concept. So what is this column? So column is a vertical entity in a table that contains all information associated with a specific field in a table. So for an example, if you see in the customers table, we have a column called as an address. So if you're going to talk about the address column alone, it represents a location description, and it would have all these information or all these data which is actually related to address. So that's actually called as a column. Next concept we are going to see is a null value. What is a null value in a table? A null value in a table is a value in a field that appears to be blank, which means a field with a null value is a field with no value. So a null value is like, you need to understand the null value as a field which is different than a zero value or a field that contains spaces. A field with a null value is a one that has been left blank during record creation. So whenever you're going to create a record in a particular table, if any field you're going to leave it blank, not even a zero value which is present there, then those blank values or those fields which contain blank, which are left blank, they are actually called as a null value. So null value is like the fields which are left blank, not even a zero value is going to be present in that particular field. Then that value is actually called as a null value. So far we have seen like what is an SQL, why we wanted to use SQL concepts, and a few of the SQL commands we have seen. We have also seen the SQL architecture. We have seen the RDBMS concepts like the database table, which is database object, which is a table. And in the table, we have seen about the records, the fields. We have seen about the null value. So thank you all for listening to my lecture. And in the next lecture, we will be talking about the constraints which are used on the table. Thank you.